shows itself, and the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials and the Millennial. Joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer on the other side of the camera. Welcome back, everyone out there in Mark and the Millennials land. We are here in Annapolis, Maryland, recording because the Maryland General Assembly is back in session. And I rarely talk about this, but here's the thing. I am a state legislator, a state delegate in the state of Maryland. And I've been doing this podcast for a while now because I want to talk about national issues. And I want to talk about national issues because the state of Maryland, as a deep blue state, is at the forefront of socialism. And this podcast is called The Left Shows Itself for a Reason. Because in Maryland, we just inaugurated a new governor. And before we go to some of the other parts of this podcast, the clips, and before we go to the dumbest bill, which is, by the way, incredibly stupid and dangerous, the left is now showing itself all across the country, but most definitely in the United States Congress and in places like Maryland, where we just inaugurated a new governor. His name is Wes Moore. And so Wes Moore, ladies and gentlemen, he was elected. He lived in Baltimore in a $2 million plus house, ran a nonprofit called you'll love this, the Robin Hood Foundation, a Democrat with a nonprofit called the Robin Hood Foundation. And the Robin Hood Foundation, according to Wes Moore's own website, is a philanthropy nonprofit that does venture philanthropy. That is to say, he takes from rich people who give their money willingly to his nonprofit, and then he gives that money to other nonprofits. Talk about not accomplishing anything and not really doing anything. That's what this governor's big claim to fame is prior to being elected. So now he's the governor of Maryland, and I'm bringing this up to you because he is the chosen one. He's the chosen one. He is the new Obama. Why do I say that? I say that because during his inauguration, I have never seen so much pomp, circumstance, and glitz ever in this state. And I want to explain to you what that means. So in the state capital of Annapolis, there is this side street known mostly to locals as Maryland Avenue. There's a really cool Irish restaurant on Maryland Avenue, by the way, called Galway Bay. But if you go by Maryland Avenue during the election, during the inauguration, you saw these production companies all along Maryland Avenue, not TV stations, because that's an obvious thing that you would have during the inauguration of the first black governor of a state. Perfectly reasonable, makes perfect sense, okay? But production companies, that is to say, his campaign arm, and I'm guessing the taxpayers as well, hired actual Hollywood-type production companies, these massive vans, massive trailers and so forth, to put on a show. It wasn't about just inaugurating a guy who's the first black governor of Maryland. It was about producing an event so that it would make him larger than life and make you think, wow, now that is a future president of the United States. Literally, that was its purpose. The purpose of the inauguration was to say, yeah, governor's too low for this guy. He needs to be president of the United States. And why does that matter? It matters because in the White House now, there is bedlam because Biden, of course, has been losing his mind for a while. We all know that. No secret. Even Democrats know that that's the case. I mean, the leftist of left Democrats know that Joe Biden is finished. And then, of course, all the classified documents, which is a whole nother issue. But he has been found having classified documents in his house, and you have the whole Hunter Biden stuff. There's no doubt in my mind the deep state and the Democrat Party, but I repeat myself, all want Joe Biden gone. So if they want Joe Biden gone, who will take his place? Kamala Harris? Maybe Wes Moore? If Wes Moore takes his place, well, that would mean Wes Moore would have only been in office for a couple of months. So what I want to talk to you about is this. This new governor of Maryland is the chosen one. He's the chosen candidate by Obama. He is the chosen candidate of Oprah. So listen to this. You had the production company producing his inauguration. There was a military flyover of a governor being inaugurated. Does anyone out there in podcast land have a problem with a governor of Maryland or a governor of any of the 50 states having a military flyover? I do. He's a civilian. The governor of a state doesn't have a military. He can say, oh yeah, but he's got the National Guard, or, you know, he can call up the police force. Okay, whatever. But he doesn't have an army. You're not supposed to have the military flight. I mean, that's the president of the United States is the commander in chief of the armed forces of the United States. A governor is not supposed to have the Air Force or the Marines or the Navy pilots flying overhead. Of course not. That militarizes the civilian office of governor. Nonetheless, Governor Wes Moore of Maryland, the first black governor of Maryland, and good for him. I want to underscore that. It's great that Maryland has its first black governor. Unfortunately, he's a leftist, so that's very unfortunate. This guy, Wes Moore, had a military flyover. Then he had a cannon salute. I've never seen that before. And then everywhere around the state capitol, you had police. Now you might say, oh, well, that's good, right? You've got the men in blue. These weren't the men in blue. These were military police because they had these massive machine guns and military outfits on all of the streets off of the state capital of Maryland. Then you had the Secret Service police and the federal police forces there as well, because Chelsea Clinton was at this actual inauguration. Chelsea Clinton. What does that tell you about what the left thinks about Wes Moore? And then Oprah. Oprah was present. In fact, Oprah introduced the new governor of Maryland. So I'm telling you this, ladies and gentlemen. You might say, oh, Mark, you're not supposed to be talking about just one state. I'm telling you about this one state today because this is the guy the left is getting behind to replace Joe Biden. Don't forget what I'm telling you. This is the truth. I am certain of it. I am 100% certain of it. How are they going to do it? I think Joe Biden I think he leaves office early. And then you say, yeah, but they can't have Kamala take over. Well, of course, she's the vice president. She's going to take over. And then, Wes Moore enters the White House as the vice president. And then next thing you know, the left tells Kamala, you're finished. You'll never be president. Wes Moore, of course, becomes the de facto nominee because he's the new guy. He's the young guy, clean looking. He's wonderful. Or Wes Moore just decides to run for president of the United States in 2024. But he'd have to announce, of course, at some point later this year, I'm thinking. So why do I say this? Finally, kind of to summarize this segment about Wes Moore, because military flyover, production company, Oprah Winfrey present, Chelsea Clinton present, many other celebrities present, military police, Secret Service everywhere. And in the state of Maryland, podcast listeners, don't forget, this is where the NSA is. Okay? And don't forget, the FBI intends to build a headquarters in Maryland that is larger than the Pentagon. They want to relocate from Washington, D.C. to Maryland. This is where the deep state lives. The deep state lives in Washington, D.C., suburban Maryland, and suburban Virginia. This is where they all actually reside physically. Except in Maryland, we actually have the NSA. And who wouldn't want from the NSA and the deep state Wes Moore to be governor? And then who wouldn't want this guy to be president of the United States? So where did he come from? Again, he ran the Robin Hood Foundation. And my understanding is he miraculously, in this nonprofit, raised like $600 million. At least that's what it said online. And please, by all means, fact check me on that, Chris, and others out there. But my understanding is from folks that we've been speaking to, that how did this guy raise $600 million if he wasn't the chosen one from George Soros and Oprah Winfrey and all the other media and rich glitterati across the world? And this is really, really concerning. So the left is showing itself, thus the name of this podcast, because they're telling us this is the man moving forward. How could you Americans vote against a black governor of Maryland who's then going to run for president of the United States or be appointed? No matter how far left he is. And keep in mind that Wes Moore sends his children to private school, and the first thing he did was what? He cut the program for private school assistance for the poorest of the poor. And Wes Moore himself benefited from private school, but he naturally doesn't believe in it for everybody else. Oh, of course not. And so then the actual House of Representatives in the United States Congress, okay, the House of Representatives, they passed a resolution denouncing socialism. Now, of course, that would be the Republicans in the House of Representatives who put forth a resolution to denounce socialism. And the vote actually split the Democrats 50-50. So half the Democrats voted with the Republicans denouncing socialism, and the other half is like, nah, I don't want to upset my base, which are a bunch of Democrats who believe in socialism. So this is the Hill magazine. Get this. The House on Thursday approved a resolution denouncing socialism in a bipartisan vote that fractured the Democrat caucus. The resolution overwhelmingly cleared the House chamber in a 328 to 86 to 14 vote. So here's what that means. It means the majority of Democrats, 109 of them, voted with the Republicans for the resolution, which says socialism is bad, but 86 Democrats voted against it, and 14 voted present, which means they were there, but they didn't want to be recorded for a yes or no vote. By the way, that's what cowards do. The people in your district send you to Congress to vote yes or no. And you have to suck it up every single time because many of the votes are difficult votes. That is a fact. And yet, you found it a difficult vote to say socialism is bad? And yes, half of the Democrats decided, yeah, socialism's okay. I'm not going to denounce it. And 14 of them said, well, I'm not going to be recorded one way or the other because I don't want to make my base mad. And I also don't want to make, it possible that someone might use it against me at some later point. So the measure, which runs 3 pages, says socialist ideology necessitates a concentration of power that has time and time again collapsed into communist regimes, totalitarian rule, and brutal dictatorships. So that's what the resolution says. The resolution further argues that, quote, many of the greatest crimes in history were committed by socialist ideologues, mentioning Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Fidel Castro, Pol Pot, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un, Daniel Ortega, Hugo Chavez, and Nicolas Maduro. And it lists atrocities committed under socialist regimes. Quote, Congress denounces socialism in all its forms, opposes the implementation of socialist policies in the United States of America, the resolution reads. When introducing the measure, the office of Representative Maria Elvira Salazar, who's a Republican from Florida, a sponsor of the resolution, said passing it would make a bold statement that the People's House, which is the House of Representatives, unequivocally denounces this cruel and unjust ideology. So, look, this podcast, ladies and gentlemen, is called The Left Shows Itself because right there, the left in the House of Representatives in the United States Congress is showing itself, at least half of them at least, that they support socialism. And you have in Maryland this guy, Wes Moore, who presides over one of the single most disgusting public education systems in the country, in Baltimore City, by the way, and where he lived, quote unquote, lived in a $2 million mansion. By the way, $2 million in Baltimore City buys you one heck of a house because the place is so depressed, which he bought through his nonprofit, naturally. You know, it's like, I know I digress, but how is it? How is it that somebody who runs a nonprofit always ends up being rich? Because isn't the whole point of a nonprofit to help others? And you're doing it so selflessly. So you pay yourself a minimum salary because you really want to help others. And this is the big scam of the nonprofit industry these days. The vast majority of nonprofits, including Wes Moore's, it was about enriching him. It was about making him a governor of Maryland. It was never about the people, because if it were, he would be implementing school choice with the worst public school system in the country. Certainly the worst in the state, and certainly top 5 worst in the country. But his kids get to go to private school. And I want to make sure, podcast listeners, not picking on his children, I'm picking on the governor for saying, oh, I get to get the benefit of great private education, or certainly I'm going to send my kids to great public schools, whichever they are, but not you folks in Baltimore. You don't get to do that. Nope, not allowed. And so to prove my point that Wes Moore is heading to the White House from the governor's mansion in the state of Maryland, in the Daily Caller today, a breaking story, it says, quote, I can't think of one thing that Kamala Harris has done. Behind the scenes, the Democrats across the country have lost hope in Kamala Harris. It's a whole article about this in the Daily Caller. And it basically says they thought that she would be willing to step up or able to step up in 2024 as the Democrats basically, get rid of Joe Biden. If they don't get rid of him before then, or if all of the investigations in the United States House of Representatives doesn't expose some of the horrible things that the Biden crime family is involved in, along with Hunter Biden, in taking kickbacks from regimes across the world. I mean, look, how else does Joe Biden afford these houses? He's got 3 houses, I think, that I'm aware of. One in Delaware on the ocean. By the way, I think it was one of the left-wing media sources said, yeah, but a house in Delaware, come on, Delaware is not an expensive state. Folks, Delaware has some very wealthy areas, just like every state does. And anyone who buys a house on the ocean, okay, they're going to have to spend millions of dollars to buy a house in the ocean. And by the way, it's a really nice house, too.
It's like Bethany, isn't it?
It's like Bethany. It's Rehoboth or Bethany, which is, by the way, are the richest areas of Delaware because they're beachfront. The houses are enormous and they're beautiful. They are. It's a beautiful area. It's a really cool town. So Joe has that house. Plus, he has a couple of more in addition to that. And he's never been outside of government, elective government in his life, except for a few short years after he and Obama left office. And that was during the Trump years, those 4 years. So there ain't no way he made tens of millions of dollars in those 4 years. He just made it while he was in office. My point here is that Joe Biden is going to be ousted from office, whether willingly or unwillingly. And the thought process of the left was Kamala will step up. But now the left is saying she isn't capable of stepping up. And if she's not capable of stepping up, then the fact of the matter is they need somebody else. Who will that person be? And therein lies my thesis in this podcast. Governor Wes Moore. Because this man looks like a Hollywood actor. I think from the left standpoint, he would become a quick superstar because he's Obama-like and he has a beautiful family. He does. He has a beautiful wife and beautiful children. And his story, while no one's actually tried to do any investigative reporting and corroborate the story in its entirety, The story from a superficial standpoint sounds great, right? Guy comes from a basic family, very humble beginnings, goes in the military and is in Afghanistan, which, I'd like to see more information on that. Receives some medals. Again, these days, you can't hardly believe anything that is happening with the deep state. I mean, do they just groom candidates? I don't know. But it's worth, thank you, journalists. Come in here and start doing some investigative journalism to find out who this guy really is. And then starts the Robin Hood Foundation and miraculously out of thin air raises $600 million. $600 million? By the way, could any of you guys out there in podcast land, if you started a nonprofit, raise $600 million for your nonprofit? Of course not. I mean, I'm not sure people can do that an entire lifetime. But Wes Moore was able to do that. And he's been a made man ever since then. And certainly, I'm sure there are certain phone calls he answers. Oprah's, Obama's, the Clintons, and George Soros, and any of the other Davos politicians, I'm sure, as well. And so we're talking about this particular podcast, how the left finally shows itself, because we understand that they are trying to do a complete and utter takeover of the country, no matter what it takes, no matter how unconstitutional it may be. And we see that because they won't even denounce, half of them won't denounce socialism in the United States House of Representatives. But we have another story here that's equally interesting about how the left is not even trying to apologize or hide what they're trying to accomplish. So get this. There are 4 things the left told you would never, ever allow happen. But now the left celebrates them. So, in the Daily Caller, 4 things the left told you would never happen, but now the left celebrates. Here's number 1. The left said, all through the election year, which was last year, CRT isn't being taught in public schools. Once Republicans came wise to the ideology being taught to young children in government-funded schools and took action against it, the left coalesced around one talking point. Critical race theory is a straw man, they said, and it's being used by conservatives to ban the teaching of Black history and marginalize minority students. The facts obviously show otherwise. Most high school students say they were taught critical race theory. According to a City Journal poll, more than half of American medical school students have implemented tenets of CRT in their mandatory programs. Maryland public schools forced 14-year-olds to take white privilege tests. Teachers in a Missouri school district discussed how to keep their discussion of white privilege from conservative parents in their district. The Virginia Department of Education promoted a pro-CRT book on their website. But more than that, Democrats' own CRT henchmen are showing their cards. Actor and comedian Bryan Cranston claimed critical race theory is essential. And Bill Maher, while listening to Cranston, who's always, of course, critical of that particular CRT program, just couldn't understand what Cranston was talking about. Another thing the left said would never happen, but now they celebrate. Number 2, predators aren't going to take advantage of trans bathroom policy. So remember that? So first we had the boys' room and girls' room, or men's room and women's room. And now, of course, it's all being blurred. It's being blurred. And that happened, and the left said, don't worry. When someone who is trans goes into the men's room, or vice versa, into the women's room, you don't need to worry about anything, because nothing bad's going to happen. These are people who are victims. The trans people are victims, and therefore they should have the right to go into the bathroom of their choice. And since they claim that biological men are actually women, what could go wrong? Well, what went wrong is that individuals did engage in sexual abuse in not just high schools and middle schools, but also in adult restrooms as well. The left said that would never happen. So wearing a dress and a wig doesn't mean someone belongs in the women's locker room. And obviously, the best solution to this quote unquote problem the left has created, because they have created this problem, is bathrooms that are single occupant bathrooms, right? You just have a bathroom. And unfortunately, that's more expensive for restaurants because I'm pretty sure that takes up a lot more space, But if you're a restaurant and you have 4 single person bathrooms, then you don't have that worry. So if you have 2 individuals going in the bathroom and they're both adults, well, they probably went in there on their own volition. And yeah, so anyway, here's the third one that the left said would never happen. We're not censoring conservatives on social media. The Twitter files revealed exactly what conservatives have been saying all along. Liberal activists at major social media companies are actively censoring conservatives. We all know that now. But didn't they say for the past 6 years it wasn't happening? Now, documents show that the censors at Twitter allowed liberal misinformation about elections to circulate. They also had secret blacklists that censor right-wing accounts. In addition to that, Twitter apparently took orders from federal officials on which accounts they should censor. Here is the fourth thing that the left said would never happen, but now they celebrate. And this is the fourth and final thing. Biological men aren't really trouncing girls' sports. Remember that? Biological men who are trans should be able to compete in women's sports, said the left. And don't worry, they're just trying to compete, because they're going through tough times, or they're menstruating, which is impossible. So therefore, they should have the right to go and participate in girls' sports. And what do you think has happened since? Well, similar to how transgender policies are hurting women in female-only spaces, like bathrooms and locker rooms, girls' sports are being taken over by men. This despite the left assuring us that no such thing would ever occur. But men are upending women's athletic matches across the country, according to analysis by the Daily Caller News Foundation. There is no equity, fairness, sportsmanship, or opportunity for women to succeed at an elite level without sex-based categories. It is crucial that as a society, we open our eyes and recognize the irrefutable damage that is being done to women's sports and everything Title IX was created for. Riley Gaines, Stand With Women spokesperson, said at the Independent Women's Forum. And she was also a former collegiate swimmer. So those are the 4 things, ladies and gentlemen, that the left said would never, ever happen. And yet they have indeed happened. And so the left is finally showing itself. And I can only imagine, if you see how the left is showing itself, that you might actually want to start thinking about who you're voting for from this point forward, or trying to advocate against some of these crazy policies. And this kind of gets me back into the spy balloon conversation, because that's part of who the left is, right? This whole idea that, well, the spy balloon's really not that big of a deal. It was just flying over the United States, first the Aleutian Islands, then came over the United States from the Northwest, then, of course, happened to fly over missile bases in Montana. And now you hear the left saying, well, but the Trump administration, it happened then too. Now, I have an interesting take on this spy balloon thing, ladies and gentlemen. Here it is. Why is it that it took an independent, regular, everyday person in America who's a camera person to find this in the sky, only to report it to the FAA? Why do you suppose that is? Because my understanding is, from a couple of articles that I've read, is these individuals saw this thing in the sky. They used their scopes to look up in the sky, and these were just regular people. I'm like, well, that doesn't look normal. It's moving really slowly, so it doesn't look necessarily alien, but it looks like a balloon. And why is it there? And if it looks that big from the ground, it must be pretty daggone big. So they called up the FAA, and the FAA is like, well, might want to call NORAD. So these folks called NORAD. And within a couple of hours, this information apparently got to the Pentagon. I'm sure they were way too busy engaging in trans surgeries, at the Pentagon, because that's what they're focused on these days. Gets to the Pentagon, and then and only then did the Pentagon acknowledge that this was a spy balloon from China. Now, why is it that you and I can't know this stuff? What kind of government do we have that thinks that we're too fragile to know how dangerous the world is right now? What kind of government says, well, I'd rather you not know that the Chinese are spying on you. I'd rather you not know that the world is getting less safe for whatever reason, but maybe you should just tell us why the world is less safe. Maybe you should just tell us what the Chinese are up to. And that way we can start preparing accordingly. We'll be much better off preparing for potential conflict now, like stocking up on food, stocking up on fuel, maybe stocking up on heating oil. Of course, the Democrats don't want us to have heating oil or natural gas. Maybe stopping going out to eat and saving money, because if the economy comes to a complete halt because we get into some sort of military engagement with China. But no, the president of the United States, who probably doesn't even know anything that's going on, I'm pretty sure the deep state's running everything. The Pentagon came out and said, yeah, this is a spy balloon, but it happened before. Well, why didn't you tell us that it happened before? This is a problem. This is a problem. So in the Epoch Times, this is where I'm going with this. This is incredibly important. If you take away anything from this podcast today, take away this. Military experts issue warnings on possible U.S.-China conflict after spy balloon shot down. Several military officials, who were former military officials, mind you, because that's why they can talk freely, said that the United States could face significant shortfalls if there is a conflict with the Chinese regime over Taiwan, coming as U.S. military jets shot down a Chinese spy balloon that drifted across the United States. Unfortunately, quote, talking broadly and in overall terms, the Chinese have dramatically increased their air, sea, space, cyber, and missile capabilities in the last couple of decades, James Anderson, acting Undersecretary of Defense for Policy under President Donald Trump, said to Fox News. In some of the scenarios, that could happen. We might well be at a competitive disadvantage initially because they have home field advantage in terms of their capacity to quickly mobilize forces against Taiwan. Last week, Representative Michael McCall, Republican of Texas, the new chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Representatives, said the odds of conflict with China over Taiwan are very high. After a U.S. general released a memo about a potential conflict with the regime in 2025. General Mike Minahan, who heads the Air Mobility Command, wrote to the leadership of its roughly 110,000 members saying, "My gut tells me we will fight in 2025. I hope he's wrong. I think he's right, though," McCall said in an interview last week. So here you have a civilian, Representative McCall, who's the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the United States Congress, United States House of Representatives. And McCall is like, yeah, well, all the experts coming to testify us, in front of us, whether an open area or whether in some sort of skiff, where you don't want anyone to know, they're kind of saying this is probably going to happen. So if there is a potential conflict or a likely conflict with China between now and 2025, why is it that the military, the folks at the Pentagon, are not telling us about spy balloons flying over the United States. Why wouldn't they want us to know? They hid it until such time as someone discovered it. So this is further proof that we have an intelligence community that's truly running the country. Because if we had civilians running the country, they'd actually be telling you what's happening. Hey, look, guys, we're living in dangerous times. We have an adversary. It's China. And that adversary is led by a dictator. And that dictator has consolidated power even more. And that dictator only listens to a few people. And anyone that comes to the dictator, which is President Xi, and tells them something that's unpleasant, well, they die or they disappear. So that makes it even more likely that when you have a dictator with this massive military, they're probably going to do something really bad. And we also have these spy balloons, my good American people, that are flying over the United States, and who knows what else is happening that we're not being told. You know, maybe there are nuclear subs in the harbors of New York or something. I mean, I don't know. They should be telling us. Because if there is a conflict with China, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have an economy in shambles. In shambles. Now you might say, oh, well, that's not true, Mark. We're going to have to, mobilize and make, guns and munitions and so forth. Yeah. When was the last time we did something like that? Like right prior to World War II? And the difference is that we don't really have an industrial base anymore to speak of, but the Chinese do. I'm talking about this, ladies and gentlemen, because this is in the context of these balloons flying over the United States. And I have a really good friend, not going to mention his name, who told me the same thing. He said, everybody tells us in the Pentagon that the next 4 years are the most dangerous period of time in American history because of the Chinese threat. And keep in mind, the Chinese axis will include China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela and Cuba. The latter two not being particularly important, but the first four very important. And you saw the first trigger of that with Russia naturally trying to indirectly control Europe through energy. And you saw the American left and the European left saying, oh yeah, we'd much rather get the gas from you because we want to be green. We don't want to have any gas here. Incredible. So I'm telling you this because something is wrong in the United States of America when you have the spy balloons coming over and the spy balloons aren't disclosed to us by your own president of the United States until a regular everyday civilian decides, hey, I'm just going to call the media because I'm seeing something and I know it's there. And then they couldn't hide it anymore. And so I was telling Chris, I had this theory that maybe we should send, remember Austin Powers with Dr. Evil? At one point, Dr. Evil gets away. It has a quick getaway with a big Bob's Big Boy balloon, We should send some Bob's Big Boy balloons over China. And just as a joke to see if the Chinese have a sense of humor.
Bet they'd shoot it down.
Yeah, I can guarantee you they would shoot that thing down. They'd probably shoot it down as soon as it got into international waters. But it would be funny. It would be funny. And yet, I am convinced that the left and the deep state, or I should say the intelligence community, because that deep state has so many different inferences, just the intelligence community. I think that the left and the intelligence community are working together to get us to not pay attention to what is happening in the world with our own intelligence community, and instead get us focused on things like the trans movement. In other words, they're diverting our attention to all these other things that really don't matter, because they really don't matter. And instead of actually looking at what our government is engaging in and what they're not doing, we are instead focused on, whether boys should be taught and girls should be taught in kindergarten gender ideology. And we're arguing over that, as we should, because it's disgusting. But the left is all about this. And I have to think that the left has been completely and utterly co-opted by the communist regime, as well as the Russians, because they are now showing themselves as being themselves very socialist, because half of the United States Congress said that they think socialism is just fine. And so they are systematically engaging in the destruction of this country, while at the same time we have China in particular, which actually might win a war against us. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh no, we'll just nuke them. Folks, the United States is not going to nuke another country. We're just not going to do it. All right? You might say, yeah, but we did it in World War II. A nuke is unthinkable. Because if we were to do such a thing, to save ourselves, if you will, we'll be destroyed between Russia and China, all the nukes they have. Humanity, as we know it, will be gone. So the war that would occur would be a conventional war in some ways. Clandestine, it'll be cyber. What would we do tomorrow, Chris, if China invaded Taiwan? You know, I mean, they make most of the world's advanced chips. I think it's 80% of the world's chips are made by Taiwan. Good luck getting another iPhone. Good luck getting a car that works. Good luck getting another laptop. I mean, life as we know it is going to change overnight. And then the left, of course, will they still be focused on the trans movement then? I'm not really sure. But one thing I do know is things are far worse off internationally than our government is telling us. And they are far more dangerous than our government is telling us. That is to say, we are very close to, in my opinion, a war with this massive country that's being led by a dictator who is the only person making decisions for the country. He literally is the only person making decisions for a country with 1.3 billion people. Imagine that. What could possibly go wrong? And so, next up, podcast listeners, we have the dumbest bill in America. And do we have a lead up, Mr. Producer?
Of course.
Here it is.
Dum 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 dum.
And it is the dumbest bill in America. And it is tying minimum wage to the CPI. That's it. Not just increasing the minimum wage, but permanently tying it to the consumer price index so that every time there's inflation, the minimum wage goes up. This is the dream of the left, and the left is definitely showing itself here. So get this, podcast listeners. In the state of Maryland, there is House Bill 549 that's being put in by the new governor of Maryland, the darling of the far left, Wes Moore. Wes Moore put in House Bill 549, which basically says as follows. Every time the minimum wage increases, there will be an adjustment to that minimum wage that the employer has to pay to the employee in the amount of that consumer price index, or 5%. So the average percentage growth in the consumer price index for the immediately 12-month period, as determined by the commissioner in Maryland, or 5%. So at least you're going to have a 5% increase every year of minimum wage for perpetuity. And you say to yourself, well, that sounds really good. I'm getting paid minimum wage. Only one problem, ladies and gentlemen. This bill applies to every company in the state of Maryland that has 15 employees or more. If you have 14 or less, it doesn't apply to you. But if you have 15 or more, it does. Because Democrats in Maryland think that 15 employees is a big company. They're so stupid. Because they've never run anything, including Governor Wes Moore. Governor Wes Moore, you know what he's run? He's run a nonprofit. So you see, at a nonprofit, when you want to pay people more, you just call up all your rich donors and then they give you money. You don't have to make money. You're just given money. And then once you are given the money, you can not only pay yourself more, which Wes Moore did. In fact, he got rich off the nonprofit, but you also pay your employees more because you care. You get to use other people's money. You don't have to actually do anything. So this bill is going to be heard in the Maryland House of Delegates, if I'm correct, within the next couple of weeks. And its purpose is to basically buy off the far left that got Wes Moore elected, and at the same time to systematically shake down the small business community. Because what the small business community is going to do is to come to Wes Moore, who effectively has a gun against their head. That's what this policy is, ladies and gentlemen. This policy that is outlined in this bill is the equivalent of putting a gun that is loaded against the head of every single business person in the state of Maryland, especially if you have 15 employees or more. Now, if you have less than 15 employees, you're going to go, oh, wow, at least it doesn't apply to me. But then why would you ever grow to 15 employees? You wouldn't. And remember, Wes Moore and the Democrats intend to push this to fewer and fewer employees as years go by, because that's what they do. They pass a bill, they're like, oh, well, there's a loophole in the old bill. 14 employees or less companies, they don't have to abide by this law, so there's a loophole. We need to close that loophole and make them pay $15 an hour plus CPI as well. Ladies and gentlemen, these people are crazy. They're crazy. And this is House Bill 549. So it used to be there was a fight for 15 in Maryland and in the blue states. Fight for 15. This is like 5 years ago. Fight for 15. Everybody should make $15 minimum wage. Fight for 15. And you'd have all the unions out there who were paid, by the way. All their protesters were paid in front of the state capitol. And you got the paid protesters going, fight for 15, fight for, and they look like I'm sorry. They didn't look like the brightest bulbs that were out there. They didn't get their brightest bulbs. It was people that are paid by the union that can afford to not work that day because they're naturally being paid no matter where they are. And they're holding these signs, and it sounds great. Except that if you ever put them in the shoes of a small business person and you realize that not all areas of any given state are created equally, some areas are poor and are downtrodden, and the average wage is much lower, but the average house is a lot less too. In some areas, of course, wages are higher. And guess what? In those areas, employees tend to get paid more because things are more expensive in those areas. It's called economics. Take a course. And so there's this article. It's from WMDT in Maryland. Maryland Governor Wes Moore announces his legislative agenda in Wednesday's State of the State address, including a measure to accelerate increases in the state's minimum wage to $15 an hour by October 2023. Well, that's like, 6, 7, 8 months away. His proposal included indexing the state's basement wage to the consumer price index so that it doesn't lose value over time, and helps businesses to plan. Oh, he's helping you plan. He's helping you plan for wage increases because, it's no longer your company to pay people that you think the amount is appropriate. And you don't get to give people wage increases. The governor's going to give them the wage increases from this point forward. That's what makes him so great. He's using your money that you make as a small business person to give increases to your employees on a regular basis without your consent. This is the left. And this is the guy, the left in the United States of America. This is the guy that they want to be president of the United States. You mark my words. He's supported by Oprah. He's supported by Obama. He's supported by George Soros. He's supported by who else? Clinton. Yeah, well, Chelsea Clinton was at his, although I have my theory about that. Chelsea Clinton went to his inauguration, Wes Moore's inauguration. I mean, my theory is the Clintons just see everybody else as a potential, competitor. So I'm sure Hillary still wants to be president. So she's trying to figure out how can I do one of two things? How can I get rid of this guy or neutralize him with Chelsea or something? But listen to this. Tying minimum wage to CPI no longer in the state of Maryland. Do Democrats think that small businesses belong to the businessman or businesswoman? No, no longer. From this point forward and forever, the conversation is, what you own as a small business person and the salaries and the wages that you set and the increases in wages that you give are no longer yours to give. They are the government's to give. And to that, I give a big finger to the governor of Maryland. I'm sorry, I got to say it the way it is. I don't know who he thinks he is or who any politician thinks they are to tell you what you have to pay. We're not living in the Depression era times, ladies and gentlemen. And if you don't think that your money is buying you enough, blame the Democrats who caused the inflation to begin with. They are literally collapsing our economy as we speak. And their big gift to you for inflation is to take money from the small business people and determine when you get wage increases and how often you get them. And that's the dumbest bill in America, tying minimum wage to CPI, Westmore's first stupid bill. And that's it for Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Getter, Truth Social, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.